Welcome back to Beyond the Plot podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by award-winning author Liz Flanagan. Liz is best known for her much-loved middle-grade fantasy novels, including the Wildsmith series and Dragon Daughter, stories that have enchanted young readers with dragons, adventure, courage, and unforgettable worlds. But Liz has also recently taken an exciting step into adult fiction with her latest novel, When We Were Divided, a powerful historical novel set during the English Civil War that explores themes of family, loyalty, love, and division. In this conversation, we talk about Liz's journey as a writer, the differences between writing for children and adults, the research and inspiration behind her historical fiction, and the magic of storytelling across genres. This was such an insightful and inspiring conversation, and I'm so excited to share it with you all. So sit back, relax, listen to Liz's story, but don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like, or share with your friends, families, or colleagues. Enjoy. Hey, Liz, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for joining. Really do appreciate it, and very excited to have you today. And I think you've got a really interesting story. So I'm very excited to release that and share, get you to share a little bit more about your background, your history, your journey, and how you got to where you are now. I think you've got some really great inspiration to share with the listeners. But before we step into that, would you like to give yourself a brief introduction to the listeners?
Yeah, so my name is Liz Flanagan, and I've previously been a children's author, but about 6 weeks ago, I released my first historical novel aimed at adults. And I've just come back from being on tour with that. Looking forward to speaking about it.
Fantastic. And that was a UK tour, correct? Did you go, what was your favourite place that you visited in that tour?
Oh, do you know what? It's been amazing. Best thing, it's been mainly in independent bookshops. So I've traveled all over the country speaking to people in independent bookshops, and each shop is different. But the thing that is the same is this wonderful connection between the bookseller and the readers, and they obviously know each other so well. I've been sitting there in the shop, doing an afternoon signing, and people have come in and just poured their hearts out to the bookseller who knows them, or it's been in the evening, terrible weather, and still people come out and are there because they want to support their local bookshop. And, that's something that an algorithm can't do, it's
No.
those human relationships. And the bookseller going, oh, you liked that book last year, you might like this one that's just come in. And it's been a real privilege to kind of witness those conversations and to bask in that lovely dynamic as I've been traveling around.
Yeah, do you know what? That's a really great point, actually, about independent bookstores, because they do probably get more of a connection with, their customers that come in, the people that come in and buy their books. And so, because they know them so well, like you said, they can recommend novels to them versus maybe some of bigger chains that you get a lot of people in. It's hard, right? And we tend to see they have more of the plaques. So like, hey, this is a recommendation for you. But yeah, I really love that. And does it feel strange, because we'll step into this in a moment, that you've gone from obviously children's books to now adult, having that different demographic, right? You're meeting now adults when you do your book tour. How did that feel for you this time?
Yeah, do you know what? It did feel really different, and it took me by surprise, because usually with children's books, I'm going into schools, I might be talking to, 200 kids in an assembly hall or leading a class, and the child hasn't chosen to be there. They don't necessarily know who I am, and I have to work really hard to get their attention and make the presentation really pacey. And, it's wonderful. I love working with kids, but actually it was a real privilege to be speaking to adults who've chosen to be there. Perhaps they've bought a ticket, they've turned up, they nod and smile at you while you're speaking, and they have brilliant questions. So you come away feeling just nourished that you've had this amazing conversation, and it's a dynamic between equals, obviously. And I'm not saying that it's not equal with the child, but it's a very different dynamic and a different energy, if that makes sense.
Yes, 100%. Yes, I can feel. I've got children myself, and I can just imagine what they're like if they attended a bookstore signing. Yes, very different kind of audience, and and unique in both their own ways. I mean, question around that, because this is your first historical novel for adults. how long have you been working on this novel for? Was it something that has been with you for a while, or what did that kind of look like?
Yeah, so it's been quite a long journey with this one, and it was back in 2020, and my most recent children's book had come out in May 2020 when the bookshops were closed. So of course it hadn't sold well, and I just didn't know if I would be able to write another children's book. So I thought, what am I going to do now? And I did some research and discovered here in the UK, or in England actually, there's Arts Council England, which funds artists of all kinds. And they had a grant called Developing Your Creative Practice, which is for artists who are ready to do something different and make a change in their practice. So I thought, well, I've always wanted to write a historical novel for adults. And so very quickly I had to do a bit of research and think hard, what would that story be? And at the time, here we were allowed to go for one walk a day in lockdown. I'd been walking up this steep hill behind my house and remembered there'd been a battle there in the English Civil Wars. And I just started thinking about that and the women of my town, what must it have been like for them? Um, and that's where the story began. So it kind of came out of necessity. I needed something to do. I had this opportunity to apply for the funding. And, that was amazing because the funding allowed me to work with a mentor to guide me through this change of direction and to really reflect and think about what I wanted to achieve with that change of direction. So it's been a really long journey, been working on it for about 5 years. And this feels, being on tour and speaking about it, it still feels like part of the process, like completion or like a transition, like handing it over to the audience.
Yeah.
So yeah, a long time for this one.
And with that association and that funding, then was it something that, like, for the listeners out there that maybe, because I've heard this a couple of times now that depending where you are, there are some, special grants or funds that will help you with your novel writing, etc. Like, did you have to research that, or were you quite aware of these associations that did that?
Yeah, I think now I am a member of certain organisations in the UK, like the Society of Authors and the National Association of Writers in Education. And, just chatting to other writers in my area, I'd kind of heard that there may be these different funds that you could apply for. And it's a question of finding the one that's right for you at that time. Some of them might be for emerging writers, some of them might be for established writers, some of them might be for, when you're ready to switch genres. So there are things out there, even in these tough financial times, there are still different pots available, and it's worth having a look to see what might be right for you. And I think when I applied, the success rate was something like 1 in 4, 1 in 5, which is not a bad rate. And even if you don't get it with your first application, I would say it's really worth getting some advice, revising your application and trying again, because a lot of people get it on the second or third attempt. So yeah, really, really worth doing, because then it can support you for, those months and really help you build your practice.
Yeah, phenomenal. So let's take it back a little bit, because I'm really interested how your writing journey began. I know you did a PhD in creative writing, but even before that, what did that look like for you? Have you always been someone that loves to write stories and imagine kind of different characters?
Yes, I'm one of those people that have loved writing stories since I could remember, since being a really young child. I just loved reading and loved to write. My generation were lucky in that when we were at school, there wasn't the same obsession with grammar as unfortunately there is now. And I know that's not teachers doing. They would much rather support creativity in a more free-flowing way. And we got to do that. My teachers might say, you can write for an hour, write a story about this lovely picture I've brought in. And I just discovered that I loved it, and I would get lost in the process. And, as a child, you don't have the same inhibitions perhaps, or I didn't back then. So I would love to write. And then as I got older, I got more critical, and I studied English literature at university. And that perhaps wasn't a great idea for somebody who wanted to write, because I just had that super critical, analytical voice in my head. And I didn't understand that writing is very different. That first drafting needs that messy, unconscious, not knowing exactly what you're doing and just getting a first draft out anyway. I thought that writers kind of produce these really polished, finished pieces. And that's where I think there is a value in doing a creative writing
Mm.
course or working with a mentor and, really learning that stuff and letting yourself play and explore.
Yeah.
So I wanted to write, but I didn't dare because I thought I couldn't. So instead, I worked kind of adjacent to writing, and I worked at first as a book editor in my 20s, and then in my 30s, I'd moved back home to Yorkshire, and I worked at Lumbank, which is Ted Hughes' former home, where Arvon, the creative writing charity, they run residential writing courses there. So I got to hang out with writers. That job it's a bit like running a hotel, but just for writers. So in a way, it was really practical and you'd be making the lunches and things like that. But you'd also be speaking to some of the best writers of our times and listening to conversations about writing. So that really helped. And then I did begin to write in my 30s when I was a parent. I was writing stories for my children, but it took 10 years of trying and failing. It took 2 novels which didn't get published, and then I'd had some folktale retellings published, and on the basis of samples of my work and those 3 little books, then I was accepted to do a PhD in creative writing, which was really transformative for me. It was at a local university, and it gave me 3 years of creative and financial support. And then I wrote Eden Summer, which was my YA novel, my debut novel. And that time, it was like a Cinderella experience of being published. There was no waiting for weeks and months of being on submission. My agent sent it out, and almost straight away there was interest. And I got to meet a couple of publishers, and I went with a really great independent small publisher, David Fickling Books, and they were brilliant. That was such a wonderful experience of being published by them. And unusually, they let me change focus. They let me switch to a fantasy novel next.
Okay.
And I think most publishers wouldn't have
Mm.
let me do that. So we called it middle grade at the time, but now I think it's actually older than that. It's at a funny age bracket. My novels Dragon Daughter, and Rise of the Shadow Dragons and The Pirate's Dragon, they're kind of for children aged about 10 to 13-ish or 10 to 14, that slightly awkward bracket. And in some countries, they're published as YA, but in
Yeah.
the UK, they were published as middle grade. But the second one came out in the pandemic, as I said,
Yeah.
and then that was quite a difficult time for me. I thought maybe my career was over then, and that publisher didn't want the third part of the trilogy. Quite understandably, they have to
Mm.
look at sales and make,
Yeah.
economic decisions, don't they?
Yeah.
So I started writing the adult historical, and meanwhile I was writing some younger middle grade, almost just to comfort myself, like what
Mm.
would little me like to have read. And that became the Wildsmith series, which has been really successful, and that went with a different publisher, Fox
Yeah.
and Ink, and they've been fantastic. So yeah, that pretty much brings us up to date.
Yeah. I mean, it's such an inspiring story though, because I mean, yeah, COVID was it was a crazy time for everybody, right? I think back to it now and you kind of like, did that even happen? Like it's a bit of a journey, isn't it? That I think we're all still trying to get over because it had such a big impact on the whole world. What do you think it took? You shared some inspiration there about, thinking about when you were younger and what you would like to read and the inspiration coming from that. But what do you think it took inside you to keep going, to keep pursuing this? Because obviously you mentioned at one point you thought your career was over. What made you keep going and pushing forward?
Yeah, great question. So I know for many people the pandemic was really, really difficult and they couldn't read or write. But for me, it was kind of the opposite. It was like I had to, and it was a wonderful escape for me. So, it's really hard to remember, isn't it, just how awful it was then, how
Yeah.
worried we were, obsessed with the news, and not able to go out. So, for a couple of hours a day, even though I was looking after my kids and trying to hold everything together at home, but there was time in the day because you weren't doing anything else. And those hours when I could write I think that's what kept me together. Especially because I was writing fantasy. It was like I got to go to this other place where, there was control and safety and only mild peril.
Yes.
It was really important to me. So it was a bit of a lifeline, actually. And so I'd stopped thinking about what might happen to these books. I was doing it for myself and for the process. And I think that that's perhaps not a bad thing. I
Yeah.
wasn't writing for publication. I was just writing for the joy and escape of writing. And I couldn't see what the books were yet or anything like that. I wasn't thinking about the future. I was just doing it to keep myself together and because I had to.
Mm.
And then, that later became a really wonderful thing for my career, but I didn't know that at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And so did you keep the same agent the whole time? Was that kind of a consistency?
No, I had an agent at the beginning, and then after my first two books, I switched, just because of what I needed at the time. So yeah, I switched agents and publishers actually after that initial part of the journey, if you like. But then it's been the same agent and publisher who published my children's books and now the adult book,
Ah,
which was
okay.
really nice. Yeah, my publisher, Fox and Ink, formerly called UClan Publishing. They're really interesting because they're been based at the University of Lancashire, formerly known as UClan. They've had a name change too, and they work with the students on the MA in publishing. So they things. They're producing a really fantastic list of books, but they're also educating the next generation of publishing professionals. And so when I published Into the Dark Forest, the first Wildsmith book, there was a student sitting in on the Zoom calls, just present, just listening to conversations between me and my editor and just observing how that process worked and how collaborative it is. So my editor might say, "Oh, I think we need something different at the end. What might that be?" And then I'd offer something, and then she'd offer something, and then I'd say, "Oh, I think it's going to be this." And that kind of verbal tennis of
Mhm.
problem solving that you do with your editor.
Yeah.
So yeah, the student got to see all of that. Other books are worked on more thoroughly by the students, as in they might commission artwork for the cover and they might edit them. And it's always overseen by, the actual editor in the publishing house. But I just think that's fantastic. And especially because it's all happening in the north.
Mm.
And here in the UK, publishing is really centred in the southeast and in London. And I just feel really strongly about building those networks in the
Yeah.
regions and supporting northern talent of all kinds, whether it's writers, illustrators, publishing professionals. I'm sure it's probably different in different countries, but it's here that's something I think that really needs to happen.
Yeah. 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 And that's lovely. I mean, that person that sat on in that conversation will eventually be having, controlling and being, the editor on, maybe in a few years' time, an author that comes in. So I think it's great to kind of that they offer that. Because you've got to you don't want it to be a dying industry, right? You want to keep making it a strong industry where people still want to write and be published and work with experts to hone their skills and have those discussions and work with the best of the best. So I think it sounds really, really lovely. In terms of, because you stayed with the same agent and the same publisher, when you decided what was the moment that you decided to then offer up the historical fiction novel that you've just released? Because obviously you're writing children's before that. Was there a time where you started having a discussion with your agent about, hey, I've been working on this, historical fiction novel. Do you think it's something that, the publisher would be interested in? When did that conversation happen?
Yeah, exactly. So I guess it was, probably about 3 years into the process. So I'd already done quite a lot of editorial work with the different mentors who had worked with me from the start. And then I thought, okay, I think it's ready now.
Mm.
So we showed it to my publisher. Even then it needed a lot of work. It's had so many edits this time, but there was a really magical moment where my agent had sent it to my publisher, who I've got a really good relationship with, Hazel Holmes at Fox and Ink. And she just sent me a WhatsApp message saying that she was reading it and she kept crying. And to me, that's, the highest compliment.
Yeah.
And so I thought, oh my goodness, she gets it. She sees the
Mm.
story as I dreamed somebody would. And her reaction to it just showed me, oh, this is the right thing. Because I've been so full of doubt with this story all along, even when it was coming out a few months ago. I didn't know if I'd pulled it off. I didn't know if people would see what I was hoping to do. And Hazel's reaction was just brilliant. And then my editors. So I worked a lot with my editor, Jasmine Dove, at Fox and Ink. And I rewrote whole sections. I rewrote the beginning and the end and added new chapters, took some out. So it was being refined, substantially in a structural
Yeah.
way, even quite recently, a couple of years ago. So it's been it's been worked and reworked, but I really enjoyed that final editorial process with Jasmine, and I knew that she loved the book as well, which
Yeah.
really helps, doesn't it? You don't mind putting in the hard work and making those changes if you feel understood.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it just goes to show, and I think a lot of authors have mentioned this, that you just need to get your story down first of all. It doesn't need to be perfect because it's going to go through several editing phases that you do, but also that your editor does as well. So if you've got a story to tell, the first step is to just write it. And it's going to be messy, but at least you've got to start and then you can build upon that, right? And yeah.
Exactly. I totally agree with everything you've just said. And it's freeing in a way, isn't it? To go, it doesn't matter about the first draft because
Hmm.
it'll change.
Yes.
And that gives us a freedom. We don't have to get hung up on it yet because we can change it later. We can change
Yeah.
everything. We can change the characters, the tense, the beginning, the ending, everything. So
Mhm.
let's just start.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what about in terms of challenges then? And I probably ask this from two perspectives. So what's been your biggest challenge, maybe as a children's author versus now as an adult fiction author? Any similarities, or do you find there's kind of different nuances there?
Yeah, I suppose the biggest challenge was, being kind of two books through a trilogy and then going, oh goodness me, is that it? And then having to find, asking myself, well, should I stop then?
Mm.
Why am I writing? And will I keep writing even if there's I'm not being published? And then so the answer to that I figured out was yes, because I have to write. So that was the biggest challenge. And just, the mental process of answering that question for myself. Because I don't think we talk enough about the ups and downs that come after being published for the first time. The goalposts change, of course. You want to be published, and then you are published, and immediately you set yourself a different goal. But nearly every writer I know has had rejections after publication. And obviously, for obvious reasons, we're not all sitting here talking about those because, it's only after you've kind of come up again that you're willing to say about the tricky times. So that was the hardest thing with my children's books. And also, I suppose because I kept changing age groups,
Mm.
I've always written the next story that I wanted to write, and I've had the freedom and the privilege to do that. I know other writers have been more kind of they've chosen a slot or a brand, and they've consistently written for that age group.
Yeah.
So it's a different approach with a lot of advantages.
Mm.
And maybe maybe I could have thought more strategically about that at the beginning. Whereas I think, writing for adults for the first time, it's being a debut again, isn't it? And, these readers don't know me.
Mm.
And so I need to establish myself and speak about this book and put in the hard work and the legwork and make sure I'm doing everything I can do to bring it to readers.
Yeah.
And now I would love to write another book for adults. And I have an idea, but I will be writing children's books for the next 18 months or 2 years.
Yeah.
So it's going to be a while before I get to write another book for adults.
Yeah, that's lovely. I was going to ask actually if you had, like, if this was going to continue, that you found another love and that, you're going to write in both different genres and also with the historical, because you said you're going to go back to children's for a little bit, but you've got another story in mind. Will you still go down the kind of historical fiction route or do you have other ideas?
The idea that I've got, I would think it might be a two-strand
Yeah.
story, to have a contemporary strand and then have a historical strand.
Yeah.
That's what I would like, but I haven't even started my research yet. So it's going to be a few years away yet.
Yeah, but that's nice to have that in the future, right? Because I think, as you mentioned, when you're creative, your mind works in many different ways, right? And I feel like when you've got a story to tell, sometimes it's not always the same stories that maybe you wrote previously. And I think it's really nice. Like I've spoken to a lot of authors that write on different pen names now because they want to step slightly into a subgenre. I was speaking to an author the other day who started her career in contemporary romance, didn't really get much kind of response and was unable to get published through that route, but then changed to now kind of that psychological thriller and got picked up. And I asked her the question, like, is this your genre that you're going to stick to? And she said, look, yes, but I'm also stepping into women's fiction and she's co-writing a novel at the moment. So I think it's just really beautiful to see that you don't have to stay in one lane. Like if you've got a story to tell, why not give it a go? And I've had other authors who are now trying to do screenwriting. So I think it just shows that you can be creative as much as you want, and there's a place for it. So you don't feel
Yeah,
boxed in.
I really like what you just said. I think so. There's always two things working in parallel, isn't there? There's your own kind of creativity and your own imagination and what you're moved to do next for your own
Mm,
development and satisfaction. And then there's the industry.
yes.
So it's, there are ways of thinking about that really positively, like you've just identified, saying, well, we can do things like have a
Mm,
pseudonym. And if we've got the support of our agent or, if we're self-published, we've got our own vision, why shouldn't we? Explore this new area with a different name. And readers just want the books they love. They
yes.
don't mind if you're writing in different genres or with different names. And that's the thing. I always want to write the best book I can that will delight that reader, whoever it is, whether it's a 7-year-old child, or a woman who loves historical fiction. I want to give my readers the best book I can, but it doesn't mean we can't move between genres and readership. So sometimes I think the industry might want to put you in a box,
Yes.
but you don't have to stay there. Yeah.
No, no. I think, yeah, because I had another author on and she had a debut and then she went to write another book and it was very different. And they said, oh, hold on a minute. No, 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 no. You need to write in this genre. She's like, oh, I didn't realize that's how it worked. So she was like, okay, I'll continue down this for a little bit. And then, maybe I'll see what my options are. But yeah, it's sometimes, yeah, the publisher is driving it. But I also think that comes with experience. And you might, because you've been in the industry a while now, yes, you started off in children's, now you've done obviously women's fiction, but do you feel like you have more confidence now in terms of like telling your publisher or agent that this is what you would like to do and them trusting that what you say is going to work, like versus maybe when you first started out being a little bit more cautious with that and maybe leaning on them a bit more than where you are now?
Definitely. I think when a writer gets published and just goes through that whole process, you're learning all the time, and I think confidence does grow. I think it's been a bit of a double-edged thing that I used to work in the industry. So on the one hand, perhaps I know behind the scenes a little bit more, so I understand about the process. So I don't fret about like the publishing production
Mm,
timeline and things like that because I know how it works and I know how it happens. And I think I even understand some of the tough financial decisions that publishers have to make because I've been on the other side of the desk as well. But then sometimes it can be negative because some of the risks involved as well.
yeah.
But I think my confidence has grown, and I think now I've got such a positive relationship with my agent and my publisher that I really, really value.
Yeah.
Um, and we meet up occasionally, or a book launch or things like that. And I think they're both fantastic, and I really admire them and how hard they work, and I really respect them as well. And I think once you've got that, it just makes everything else much more manageable and takes away a lot of the stress.
Yes.
I see myself as part of a team putting a book in the world. And I
Yeah.
know that everybody works really hard in that team. My agent, foreign rights person who's incredible, and at the publishing house, like the cover designer is fantastic. The editor is wonderful. Been working with a brilliant woman on the PR. And I just see myself as one of that team.
Yeah.
And that gives me confidence. It allows me to do something like this today and
Yes.
speak about my work because this is the bit that I can do.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, and I owe it to them to do it as best I can.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, feeling like part of a team gives me confidence.
Yeah. And I think that's lovely because it's quite a solitary kind of role, isn't it, when as a writer, because you're generally by yourself, and unless you go to retreat or you schedule catch-ups with maybe fellow writers as well, but it can be quite solitary. So it's quite nice to know that like you have then a team. It's like a win team, right? It's like everybody is there to support you, lift you up, to make sure that that book gets the best possible chance that it has to be put out in the world and to be seen, which I think is lovely.
Yeah, isn't it such a weird job that I say this to kids when I'm speaking to them, like half the job, in fact, it's more like 80% is so solitary. You're sitting on your own at
Mm,
home in your comfy clothes, and it's entirely up to you. How far are you going to push today? How many hours are you going to do today? Where are you going to take this story? So solitary. And then the other little bit suddenly demands that you find your extrovert bit if you've got one, and suddenly you're speaking to
yeah,
sometimes large numbers of people. It doesn't always suit authors, does it, having that switch? Personally, I think I do love it. I'm mostly an introvert, but I also love speaking to people. So it's going to be hard now to give up the chatty bit
yeah,
and go back to the silence and the solitude. I do really value both parts. But then I also recognize that I get very tired after being on
yeah.
tour and I need to go and recharge as well. But yeah, what a strange job.
Yeah, it's like you've got to be two personalities, right? You've got to be
Yeah.
like right to where, yeah, you're by yourself with your own thoughts and you're creating these people and these images, and then the other side of it, yeah, is you've then got to be the host, right? And
Yes.
it takes a lot of energy as well, doesn't it, to put yourself out there, to talk in front of people and to share your book. So I do feel that you probably are feeling right now that you need to re-energize and yeah, just get a bit more of yourself back again to yeah, to energize and be, yeah, back to writing and inspiring yourself. And I was going to ask you one of a question about that before I get you to share kind of a little bit more about your latest book. Where does a lot of your inspiration come from? And that can be from, I mean, if we focus on the children's part for a moment, where do you get all that inspiration from?
So I think a lot of it comes from landscape. I live in a really beautiful part of the world and there's lots of woods around here. So the Will Smith book, Into the Dark Forest, the forest in that story is definitely
Mm.
based on the woods around here. And then each of the books in that series, I can say it was inspired by this place, but also from reading in that series. There's a
Yeah,
different mythical creature in each book. So definitely my childhood reading, and then inevitably, and this is what I don't see till afterwards, there's something from my own life that I've been working through. And
yeah,
then afterwards I go, oh, that's what that was about. And
yeah,
even though it's so obvious, like my debut novel, Eden Summer, it's about a girl whose sister has just died. And I wrote that in the years after my brother had died suddenly. And it's like, I kind of knew it, but now it's so obvious. And there are
yeah,
sections of that book I actually find really hard to look back on. I had to read it aloud when I was running a workshop a couple of years ago, and it was really hard. I'm like, oh my God, this feels so personal. This feels like
yeah,
my heart on a plate. It's like, how did I pull that off? So it's a mixture.
Yeah, it's almost like your subconscious, isn't it? It's like you going through your own therapy session, like putting it out there. It's I have heard that before. Yeah, that people write and then once they read it back, they realize that, oh, I didn't even realize that's very familiar, or that's actually something that's happened to me. So yeah, I can
Definitely.
imagine
Yeah.
quite personal as well. Yeah, when you do read something like that, because it's a connection again, isn't it? It brings you back to something, yeah, that's happened in your life. But again, I always think that that's a hidden message, because maybe someone who's reading that who has gone through the same thing, or a parent has gone through the same thing. It's like, yeah, I'm sure someone's read that book in a way and had a connection from you incorporating that story into your books.
And I think maybe that's why that was my first book to get published, because I
Mm.
had to learn how to engage with that unconscious process and let it happen,
Yeah.
and to just put more of myself in the stories in that unconscious way. Whereas the first two novels, maybe I was just learning to write, and I hadn't yet mastered that process.
Yeah.
It's just so strange that you don't know till afterwards that so much of it is unconscious, like you just said. So with the new book, when we were divided, I had the things that I thought it was about, divided society. And then only afterwards I went, oh, it's about my anxieties, about my children growing up and leaving home. Jane's son goes off to war in the story, and she falls apart. And thank God my children haven't gone to war. But my
Yeah.
daughter has left home and is living away from me, and just getting used to this new rhythm in our lives of, being a mother who's very present when your child is home, and then
Mm.
letting them go when they go and live their own life. And, just learning to manage that. And now I can go, oh yeah, that's what this book is about, as well as all those other things.
Yeah, amazing. So do you want to give a brief kind of overview, a synopsis of When We Were Divided? What's it about?
Yeah, so it's set in 1643, and here in England, the Civil War had just broken out the summer before, and then the war is getting closer and closer. So I have three main characters. There's sisters, Jane and Isabel, and they're on opposite sides of the war because of their marriages and because of their own personalities. Jane and Isabel are sisters who are opposite in every way, and they're already estranged from each other because 12 years earlier there was a terrible plague outbreak, and Isabel was quarantined inside the house with the family, and Jane was stuck outside the house. And they've each taken the worst understanding of that time and blamed the other for what happened. So then the war breaks out, and the story begins with this family dinner where there's extended family present, and somebody brings up politics, and it's awful. It's a complete disaster. And Jane's son, Ned, vows to go and fight for the king. And then everything is put in motion for the story. There's another character, Kit, who is also in the king's army. And Kit is somebody who's had to take on a different name and identity to survive. And so Kit is there in the battle, witnessing the violence firsthand and seeing what happens. And then Kit and Jane and Isabel all come together again when there's this terrible attack on Heptonstall just up the hill from here. And although they're on different sides, they're brought together by this terrible event. And the story overall, yes, it's about war, it's about division, it's about quarantine, but the overall movement is towards forgiveness and reconciliation and hope. So the question is really, what will unite these sisters when they're so divided?
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. I mean, it seems that there's so much depth to the story. Like, even just you sharing that, I was like, wow, gosh, you must have, like, just the creativity in your mind to come up with all those different characters and all those different scenarios, like, would have been, I can only imagine, very intense. I mean, how did you create those characters? Like, did they come to you instantly, or was it a work in progress?
Yeah, so Isabel came to me first. She feels a bit like the main character in a way, and I could picture her on the hill, somebody who loved being outside, and there's this wildness and independence to her. And then I thought, okay, she's got to have a sister. And then, my kids are completely opposite. So I was thinking, who would be opposite to Isabel? And I did a big list of contrast points.
Yeah.
And they're opposite in every way. And then I thought, that's not enough. I need another character. So Kit is this younger person. And Kit's sections are first person present tense because it suits the kind of the action and the violence and then the movement that Kit has. And then it was all about how can I bring them together, braid these storylines together in a really satisfying way.
Can you see any character like having their own story?
To me, I feel like that the story is complete now.
Yeah.
And, it was such a turbulent time. Really, I got so fond of these characters, if that's not a weird thing to say about, figments of your own imagination. But I just really felt this kind of empathy for women who lived through this
Yeah.
turbulent time, like the shock of it, a civil war, and then they didn't know how it was going to end. They didn't
Mm.
know that they were going to execute the king. They couldn't foresee what was going to happen. Like everything that happened in society in that, say, 20 or 30 years must have just felt like the end of the world to
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. Very different life to what we live in now, right? I think we can't even imagine. A crazy question then. What was maybe one of the craziest things that you Googled while writing this novel? I always love to ask, I haven't asked on the podcast before, but I've definitely asked authors in person. But can you remember, was there something that you Googled that you just think, okay, that's quite shocking, or that's, yeah, a bit
But
crazy?
I think, we don't think or talk much about this time, but it was our revolution.
Mm.
And in fact, what women got up to, like happens in every war when the men are called to fight, women have to step up. And just researching what they achieved, women were like leading siege defense. They were like literally throwing things over the battlements and pushing the ladders away and defending their homes. Not only noble women in those big castles, but also like ordinary women, like building earthworks to defend their towns and putting out fires and spying, because what a brilliant disguise that a woman might not be suspected. So she could be smuggling letters around and just incredible facts that seem more like fiction, but
Yeah.
they're real documented facts. And yes,
Yeah.
disguise, that was another big theme. And I learned about people disguising themselves, either men disguising as women or the other way around, to escape and to
Brilliant.
survive. And all these ideas, definitely went into the story. So it was more like I was shocked by the research and what I
Yeah.
didn't know about women's lives. And although it was very different, like you said, there are parallels. So I tried to pick up on those parallels,
Mm.
just as we are worried about new technology. So for us, it's say AI and unregulated internet. For them, it was unlicensed printing presses.
Mm.
And the anxiety is just the same, and it would have felt just as real and scary and new back then. Like military technology, we worry about what's going on in the world today with drone warfare, and they would have been shocked by what these new muskets could do,
Yeah.
and the violence that could be inflicted on the human body. That was new and that was horrific. And they were thinking about, democracy and who gets to rule. And when one man changes the rules to suit him, it's like, oh,
Yes.
yeah, there's a few parallels there, aren't there?
Yeah, wow, yeah, yeah, now you say it like that, yeah, yeah, there are some commonalities still in the world that we live in today. But yeah, what a journey to kind of just unravel that and yeah, just enhance your knowledge around that kind of era and incorporating maybe a lot of more facts into that book, even though it's a fiction book, to make it as realistic as possible.
Yeah, yeah, I really love doing the research about women's lives. At the beginning, I got really overwhelmed by research. I was trying to learn everything about the Civil War, and I nearly stopped before I'd started writing. But then by bringing it more specific,
Mm,
and focusing on women and my local area, then it got exciting and enabling. And I thought,
yeah,
well, I don't need to know everything because that could literally take the rest of my life,
yes.
And with historical fiction, I thought I'm not a historian, and I got really intimidated by the need to get things right. But
Mm,
then some more experienced writers than me said, look, with historical fiction, it's the fiction that people love. It's the story. Focus on your characters and
yeah,
bring in, the history has to be there. But if they wanted pure history, they would read a history book. So
yeah.
remember, it's about story and about character, and then off you go.
Yeah, yeah. Fantastic. Well, I wish you all the best. I think you've got a really inspiring and fantastic story. And I think just showcasing how you've stepped from one genre to a next and you've been so successful, but also sharing the challenges that you've had to overcome along the way, and that the process isn't so straightforward, right? You still have to keep pushing forward, determination, perseverance, and really putting yourself out there. I think it's great, and I'm really excited to kind of read more of your adult fiction. But I love the fact that you're still staying true to your roots and doing the children as well, and not giving that up because obviously you're super successful in both genres. Before we go, where can people find you? Do you have a website? I know you're on social media, but yeah, share more where people can find you if they want to start following you.
Yeah, thank you. My website is lizflanagan.co.uk. So it's just my name. And then I'm on Instagram as LizzieBooks17. And thank you so much for your questions. I really, really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're absolutely brilliant. So thank you so much for joining. And just quickly with your books then, in terms of where people can purchase them, obviously in the UK, independent bookstores, some of the more bigger bookstores, are they available outside of the UK?
Yes, they are. My children's books, the Wildsmith series, is definitely available in Australia. Most of them are available in the US, and there's translations in Europe. So, yeah, all the usual places you can find them.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you're welcome. Thanks so much, Liz.
Thank you very much.